All right, let's jump right in. You've probably heard this a million times. Addiction is a brain disease. It's the go-to explanation, right? But what if that's not the whole story? Today, we're going to dig into the evidence that seriously challenges that simple idea.
I mean, this is the official line. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, puts it right there in black and white. A chronic, relapsing brain disease. This is the lens through which almost everyone, doctors, policymakers, you name it, views addiction.
But what if that neat and tidy definition is actually missing some huge, crucial pieces of the puzzle? What if the reality of addiction is way more messy and, honestly, more interesting than that? That's exactly what we're going to explore.
So, let's start by taking a closer look at that first word, chronic. It makes you think of something that's lifelong, something you're stuck with forever. But, when you actually look at the data, a very different picture starts to emerge.
And this brings us to what you might call a paradox. We have these massive studies that have followed thousands of people for decades, and they found something pretty amazing about recovery. So if addiction is really chronic, like, say, diabetes, how do we explain the fact that so many people just get better?
Let's get into the actual numbers. A huge survey called the Epidemiological Catchment Area Study found that for people who were dependent on drugs by the time they were 24, more than half of them later reported having zero symptoms. And I mean zero, not just fewer.
And it doesn't stop there. By the time those same people reached age 37, that number jumped to a whopping 75%, 3/4. And here's the kicker. Most of them did it without any formal treatment at all. They just aged out of it.
So what does this all mean? Well, when you actually compare addiction to other psychiatric disorders, it turns out its remission rate is about twice as high. It's led some researchers to flip the script entirely and call it the least chronic of these conditions. That's a pretty big deal, and the total opposite of the story we're usually told.
Okay, so we've poked some holes in chronic. Now let's look at the next big word, compulsion. The whole brain disease model really hangs on this idea that drug use becomes compulsive, that it's totally outside of a person's control. But is it really? So the sources we looked at make a really critical distinction. We tend to think of a compulsion as something automatic, like a sneeze. You feel it coming, but you can't just decide not to do it. But there's this other idea called a motivational compulsion. It's this incredibly powerful urge, for sure, but it's one that can still be influenced by things like rewards and punishments. There's still choice in there.
This story about a guy named Leroy Powell just nails the point. He had chronic alcoholism, gets arrested, an expert even testified that he couldn't control his drinking. But on the day of his trial, Powell himself said he'd only had one drink that morning. And why? Well, because he knew he had to show up to court. That consequence was real enough to override what was supposed to be an unstoppable compulsion.
Let's make this crystal clear. Think about Alzheimer's disease. You could never offer someone with Alzheimer's $1 million to stop their brain from degenerating. It's just not possible, right? Because the biology of that disease doesn't care about incentives. But with addiction, we see over and over that incentives, both good and bad, can totally change behavior. It suggests we're talking about two fundamentally different kinds of problems.
Here's a cool way to think about it. Imagine a computer that's learning to play chess, but one little part of its program develops a weird bad habit. It becomes obsessed with taking other pieces with its queen, even if it's a terrible move. Pretty soon, this one learned pattern is making the whole program play awful chess. Now, is the computer's hardware broken? No, but its software, its learned priorities, is all out of whack. It's a great analogy for how addiction can be a problem of learning, not just broken hardware.
So, if addiction isn't just this chronic, compulsive thing happening inside the skull, then what are we missing? Well, the big critique here is that by focusing only on the brain, we might be looking through a microscope when we really need a wide-angle lens.
A neuroscientist named Harold Callant put it beautifully. He said a reductionist approach that's basically just trying to explain a big, complex thing by looking at its tiniest parts, like brain cells, can tell us how the brain is changing, but it can never, ever tell us why it's happening to one person and not another. It totally misses the context.
And look at this. This is where it gets really wild. This study with monkeys shows how context can literally rewire the brain. They found that monkeys who were lower on the social ladder, the more stressed out ones, had fewer dopamine receptors in their brains. And as you can see on the right, those are the exact same monkeys who chose to take way more cocaine. Their social world directly changed their brain chemistry, which then changed their behavior. This opens up a whole different way of thinking. What if addiction isn't a disease at all, but more of a response to a person's environment? From this viewpoint, addiction could be a symptom of what some call social dislocation.
That feeling of not having a real community, a solid identity, or a sense of purpose in our often fragmented modern world.
Okay, so we've looked at all this evidence that complicates the simple brain disease story. So where does that leave us? What is addiction then?
Well, it seems it's not just one thing. It's way more nuanced. It looks like a disorder where choice is still a factor. It's a deeply learned behavior. It's often a response to the world around us. Sure, biology has an influence, but it doesn't seal your fate. And maybe at its very core, it's a problem of motivation.
So maybe there's a better term for it. Instead of a disease, what if we called it a disorder of self-regulation? I like that because it captures the whole picture. The choices are intentional, but they clash with what the person knows is best for them in the long run. It acknowledges that internal battle without just writing off personal agency.
And that leaves us with one last big, tough question to chew on. If we decide to move past the simple brain disease label, we have to start talking about things like choice and meaning and community. But does that make the problem easier to fix? Or does it mean the solutions have to be just as complex and just as human as the problem itself?